Welcome to day 2 of the phase 2 of the experimental approach in appropriating Lonergan's both transcendental method, functional specialties, and his worldview of emergent probability. This is a continuation of the case study. Last week we started to tackle the primary problem, or the primary question, which is what are the core level of that we're interested in, what is the level above it that is sublating that primary level, and also what is the level below it that conditions the emergence of the primary level that we're interested in doing. At that time we indicated that the upper level was very clearly the transcendental realm of the divine mystery, understood from our perspective, from a very Christian perspective, not doctrinarial, but with the emerging methodology and theories that we're in the process of developing as part of this Cosmopolis group. There was a certain problem with the core level. We had originally identified it as being the global level, but upon a week or two of reflection, it really included both the global, regional, and local levels at an institutional structure. Now this changed the whole conditioning aspect of it, which meant that it could no longer be at the institutional level. That would be just belong to the same realm of intelligibility. It had to be something lower. So one of our innovations this week is to block out in a better way those three levels and to start to sketch the relationships between them. I'd like to start off with something that I encountered this week, the notion of VUCA, VUCA, which apparently is becoming very popular in management type of people who have to deal with complex systems at the global level. There's a small video, very short video, explaining the basic terms and why they're being used, and I've attached that to the website. But to break it down, the V stands for volatility, the U for uncertainty, C for complexity, and the A for ambiguity. And like I say, you can go to the YouTube video that's at the website to get a little bit more of an idea of what these terms mean. They're interesting from our perspective because in some ways they outline some of the basic dynamics that people who are setting policies and planning or trying to work at regulating whatever it is that they're interested in regulating are increasingly encountering simply because of the complexity of our society, the lack of any formal appreciative system to provide a common way of understanding problems, so that some problems aren't even recognized by some people and are recognized by others, and vice versa. It can become very conflicting and very fragmented. But it does give you a way of understanding the reality of the world of emergent probability, because in some ways this is a descriptor of what it's like to live in a world of emergent probability. One of the things is you can never anticipate what's going to be happening because there's always the possibility of an emerging level of intelligibility that will sublate what you're doing. There's also the possibility that the level that conditions your existence in your core operations are themselves fragmented. So generally speaking, we have the VUCA, living in a complex, dynamic, emergent, largely open-ended society. The interesting part of that for us is the fourth one of ambiguity. Ambiguity is an uncertainty as to what's going on. I suppose you could call it the equivalent of the fog of war, in which you really don't, there's a whole area of things that are simply missing from your understanding that is either beyond your comprehension or belongs to that realm of you don't even ask the question, so you don't even know what you don't know. The use of this for us is the better the context in which you frame events, the less likely you're going to have that sense of ambiguity. And this is something that Lonergan does, I think to a T, both by his transcendental method, which applies to the individual coming to know and to be, but also to the functional specialties, which apply to the collective, to the team, or to the institution that's involved in, again, working on the issues of the day and so forth. The structure that we're proposing for our initial set of 3 levels of intelligibility really represent a first cut to setting a proper context within which you can better understand what is going on and decrease the likelihood of being blindsided or overtaken by events or somehow just being left out of the cold because you missed something that you should have been aware of all along. It requires a certain amount of effort. It's necessary now because of the degree of complexity and ambiguity that we now face. So this is one of the primary reasons why Lonergan's approach and his tools are becoming, increasingly becoming a necessity rather than a luxury. And it certainly no longer belongs strictly to the realm of the intellectuals and to the educational institutions, but now have to find a place within the common sense reality of most people, particularly those intelligent people of common sense who have to get on with the mired business of the world, which is never ending and constantly demanding. So we have ambiguity as one of the key things that we're focusing in, that our scheme attempts to provide a context that will remove a fair amount, but not all, of this kind of fog that clouds our thinking, that leads us to the use of terms that no longer have meaning, or to create terms that again are more fictional or more mythic than real. So we have the VUCA with its ambiguity. We have the dealing with the right type of context in which to frame things, to better understand things. And then the third element is the world process of emergent probability. Now this we had already covered in our phase 1 as just an introduction to this notion of worldview of world processes operating according to this worldview of emergent probability. But now is the time we start to put this tool to use, because our primary question, our first initial question that we need to really address in a more or less adequate manner before we can proceed to anything else, is what are the core levels, the sublating and the conditioning levels that are going to affect our area of interest. In this particular case, it's global fundamental institutional change, largely at the global level, because this is where a lot of the major conflicts are working out, but also they reverberate through the local and regional levels too as well. So it's all a complex institutional structure that is undergoing change at various levels, and it's always a question of balancing. Some institutions are in conflict with each other, some cooperate, but there's certainly no overarching sense of a common perspective or a common appreciative system to understand what is actually taking place. So the first part we're going to be dealing with is really trying to understand how to apply Lonergan's worldview of emergent probability. So the references to insight are particularly important as the chapter on process and decline in method 2 as well. All the references are there in the phase 1 material that was handed out. When we go on to the next, we deal with the levels. Now, as I mentioned before, our initial level is definitely the transcendental. That's a top level, because we consider that everything that's happening in human societies is being in some ways sublated by this divine mystery operating at the transcendental level. Furthermore, in the theory that we're proposing of a human life cycle, the idea of the transcendental level is not something outside of a human being, but is actually an integral part of being human. In this theory that we're proposing, that you'll find at another place on this website, we start off with the purely physical aspect of the brain, and the brain has its own way of organizing reality long before consciousness ever sets in. We call this, it's a kind of a mediated world in which the interests of the animal for survival, for food, for shelter, and so forth, create a world of scarcity, of loss, of separation, and also of death. Although death is a bit more complex when it becomes a part of the conscious level. The first emergent really property of this is human animal is consciousness. And for us, it's the intentionality of consciousness, as Lonergan points out, that is critical rather than an understanding of the various forms and functions that consciousness kind of not carries out, but is characterized by human consciousness. Therefore, we don't go into this terribly much because we simply figure that Lonergan has covered a lot of the material in his transcendental method, outlining the cognitive structure of experiencing, understanding, judging, and deciding. And curiously enough, the level of experiencing is really the part of the mediated world created by the brain that is allowed or sent over to the conscious level, and then upon that we build. We also have the level of understanding those experiences, making judgments as to what is true, what is not true, and eventually deciding, which requires judgments of value in terms of what is important to you in order to decide what course of action you're going to take when you start planning. This first really emergent level of being human, although technically speaking the animal is the first emergent level, the second one is consciousness. The third one is a transcendental aspect. And this is part of being human because the unrestricted desire to know, operating through consciousness, eventually leads to something that is external to human reality. The proportionate understanding of human reality encounters something greater than itself. And this has occurred in any society, any place. There's always been this drive towards understanding this transcendent level, which is simply something that lies outside the area of the brain's physical world, the conscious mind's creating worlds mediated by meaning, and now are involved in understanding the roots of how these worlds are created according to some divine mystery. Our particular orientation at that level is Christianity. There are a variety of reasons for that, which we really won't go into at this point in time. But in many ways, it brings together in the same package within the same individual, both the human aspect of our mortality with the divine aspect of immortality and transcendence. So from our perspective, through Christ, we find that through the hypostatic union, the individual now can operate within the kind of the kingdom of God or the community of saints or the mystical body of Christ, whatever you want to call it, in such a way that it really impacts upon what is happening at the institutional level as we go into carrying out the daily business. Now the three levels are they're very tentative at this stage. They're just identification. Understanding what they are, how they operate, will evolve over the next several weeks, perhaps several months, depending on how this goes. But I'd like to start with the fundamental level that we've identifying at the moment, and that is something we could call a standing wave of energy. See, the thing is that at the institutional level has to take care of its energy uses, in the sense that if it doesn't pay attention to the support structure, all the higher levels of regulation, the politics, and various other things like that go down the drain because there are not enough resources to actually make anything of any complexity whatsoever. Early examples of this would be in the hunter and gathering societies, whose institutional structure really only allowed them to take advantage of a certain amount of solar energy according to the tech tools and techniques that they had evolved at that time. As the core level of the institutions became more complex, Then we started shifting into agricultural, in which case it was a better use of the solar resources, solar energy resources. And now you could, instead of being a nomadic kind of hunting and gathering society, you now have stable communities that could incorporate the energy, some of the energy into building things like stable buildings, dams, large structures for religious observances and so forth like that. So we can consider the buildings themselves as being a part of the standing wave of energy that the institutional context makes available for human beings at all purposes. The important point for the core level of the institutions is that no matter what they think they are doing, they're going to have an impact on, they're going to sublate in some ways the energy, that standing energy waveform that constitutes the physical and float and material well-being of that society. If they go far astray, they're quite likely to downgrade the energy sources, which means the society will become less complex, more fragmented. The order will break down into smaller individual units that in human history are traditionally tribes, clans, ultimately the individual family. When we get into the core aspect of the institutional, so the core, there's a responsibility there, whether it's assumed or not, of taking care of the mechanism that provides a steady stream of particular goods to the people who are part of that institutional structure, that civilization or whatever. So this is actually a prime responsibility of the institutional structures. Failure to meet that responsibility ends in, as I mentioned, in fragmentation, decline, and so forth. So this is a primary concern. The other aspect of the central core level of the institutions, be they global, regional, or local, is that they're all are being sublated to some extent, in some mysterious way, by this transcendental realm of meaning that seems to permeate the human space. And this can be so even if the society itself considers it as being agnostic, purely secular, and so forth, because the transcendental element is built into what it means to be human. That element of transcendence is therefore allocated to something of a human creation that then becomes transcendent and something that people are expected to follow, and it is just a natural order of things. A good example of this would be Marxism, the socialism, in which the whole community becomes the most transcendent thing. The ideology of socialism becomes the religion. There's also a pagan quality to it as well that deals with clan and family. That is all intermingled in this. And in some cases, society's fundamental conflict is between the institutions that are grounded in tribal and clan and family sort of structures, which we would normally consider traditional, and then those that are moving into this higher energy level of existence, which requires things like the transcendental method, functional specialization, a higher degree of awareness, of consciousness, and so forth. That's involved in all that. So there is a conflict between the institutions that support one and the institutions that support other, and that's one of the fundamental conflicts operating at the institutional level. The sublation is only part of the effect. The institutional conditions and the ideologies and the worldviews and the appreciative systems that give it meaning, in fact, you could call it the world mediated by meaning that humans create in order to build their institutions, to build their societies, to build their civilizations. These are all have an impact on the degree to which the transcendental realm, to which the divine mystery can operate in human affairs. Now, this is not to say that the transcendental method, or the transcendental realm with its divine mystery, is directly managing history per se. But it does mean that the divine mystery has a way of infusing the transcendental realm and enhancing it within the individual, so that the source of power or the source of control for the individual shifts from an animal concerned with reproduction, with food, security, safety, and so forth, to more conscious endeavors of values that are consciously set up and desired by human beings, to a level that deals with transcendental values, something that's more important. And this leads within the individual to Lonergan's identification of three fundamental modes of conversion. Dorian adds the fourth of psychic conversion, which is important, but not quite at what we're dealing with. The intellectual conversion is, first of all, a shift to a proper understanding of reality. And that is a shift away from naive realism, from an epistemology of conceptualism, from an empiricism that says that only what is real is something that you can measure, and into Lonergan's critical realism, which is grounded in his transcendental method of experiencing, understanding, and judging and deciding. Now, these changes to the individual, intellectual, also there's moral changes, which are very difficult for people to deal with, because it's hard for an individual to put their own satisfaction and well-being secondary to something outside of themselves, let's say something sacred or the idea of truth or justice, and actually counter it. In fact, one of the characteristics of a totalitarian regime is that it kind of takes over that and provides a moral question in which the individual has to do harm in order to avoid doing another form of harm. And a good example of that was in the Ukraine during the Stalin years with the starvation. And the individual Ukrainian leaders who are part of the Communist Party were put in a very, very difficult position, in the sense that they either had to allow their own fellow citizens to starve, or they would find their own family and their families' families basically eradicated, sent to the gulags, if that was a desirable outcome, if not simply exterminated downright. So when you're faced with a choice between that, you can see what totalitarian regimes tend to do. You can also see just how difficult it is to take a moral stance. It is not something we like to think we do, but in reality, when it comes down to the crunch, we're not quite so sure of our moral authority, of our moral ability to handle situations like that. So best not to be tempted, shall we say. The third level of change of the individual is the falling in love with the divine mystery. And this in Christianity is falling in love with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as a Trinity, taking on some of the aspects and joining into the creative endeavor that they are involved in. So we become co-creators in the universe, which has in some ways been left incomplete for that very simple reason that we're asked to share in this act of co-creation. But it's difficult to share in an act of co-creation if you have no idea what you're up to. So again, this is part of the contextual dealing with ambiguity that we're starting to work on and to start to make real, and to start to understand and incorporate to the extent that is viable or not viable. Because the other thing, this is largely, I wouldn't say speculative, because it is grounded in certain realities. But it is exploratory. And like any exploration, particularly in its early levels, there's going to be mistakes made, things are going to be kind of gilded over. Later activities will correct these mistakes and so forth. So one expects a certain amount of kind of leeway at this stage, because we're trying to bring something into being that is yet to really be being given form, much less actually activated at the level of action in the metaphysics of potency, form, and act. So the working on the interplay of these three levels, how the core level both sublates the standing wave pattern of energy, but also conditions how the divine mystery can be manifested at the transcendental level in human life, and also the aspect of how the transcendental level already sublates human activities and how the energy level already conditions what we can and can't do at the institutional level in providing this steady stream of goods. So the other aspect that we're getting into is starting to identify the patterns of conflict and cooperation that are taking place among the different institutions that are involved in our core level. Now, the basic theoretical structure, the basic high-level operator that we're dealing with is the idea of conversion. And the idea that converted people will take a position on any particular issue, and their position will be well-grounded because they're intelligent, understanding, reasonable, and responsible. And is simply more likely to be a position that can be developed and improved upon as part of the ongoing development of a society. The unconverted, however, create a very different reality. And this is the variety of counterpositions that can exist. And one of the important things that we'll be getting into later, once we've established the framework, is which are positions and which are counterpositions. Because the problem with counterpositions is because they've been developed by people who really don't pay attention to experience, are not particularly intelligent when it comes to understanding, or when it comes to making judgments as to what is real or true, have their judgments affected by their own egotism or group bias. And then there's also the common sense bias, as we mentioned in phase 1, that's also operative too as well. And on top of it, falling in love with God is just not part of their experience. Because for people who are not engaged in this falling in love with religious conversion in this broad sense, rather than doctrinarial and belonging to a particular religious institution, people who are engaged in that take the opposite position, that the real kind of God or the real total authority or the real general managers of the universe are themselves. So counterpositions in some ways can be identified by the desire for power, the desire for dominance, for ruling over other people according to the way in which they would rule. Now, the transcendental realm influences this by saying that if you want to be a leader, you need to be a servant. So this is one of the radical changes that are unfolding in human history and will probably take many more thousands of years to really reach any sort of fruition. But it is a process that's going on. And it lies in opposition to this desire to dominate and to control. Now, the roots of that have their roots originally in the brain's mediated world of scarcity, of lack, of the need for reproduction. It has its roots there, unfortunately. But when you get into the transcendental realm, there's a shift in meaning in which a lot of these activities are seen now as being artificial within the greater context of this divine mystery, of this transcendental reality. So this is something that we'll be coming up to, the identification of positions, counterpositions, because in the identification of these, you're going to find the fundamental kind of fault lines or the fundamental areas of conflict, and these are the areas in which the institutional structure is engaging in change, is changing. So some change faster than others, some change for the worse. There's a whole mix that's going to be rather difficult to deal with in its complexity. But our advantage is that we have a higher level operative set of operations that we can refer to that greatly reduces the complexity, that allows us to be able to handle the complexity of the data and to give it form and meaning within a consistent structure. This is our long-term goal, As we conclude the phase 2, we shall have hopefully a better understanding of how to use Lonergan's tools, and then in phase 3 we go on to where you yourself start to engage in your own research issues using these tools, because now you have an example of how they can be used. So we're working on the example phase, that's our conclusion for today. I'll attach this as a video. I will also provide some of the basic notes and further details behind it in a written section underneath this, and see you in a week or maybe 2, depending on how the whole system processes. We are under the guidance of a higher power, not too much ourselves, although it's a combination of the two, creating a reality that has yet to be created. So thank you. This is Russell Baker signing off for today.